Thanks for the great introduction, and I'm glad to be part of this great program. I congratulate the people who assembled this program. I am going to be talking about an area of research that interests me in general, but I want to give a brief introduction to it first. Since I'm trained as an architect, I believe I have the right to insult architects. So for years I wondered why, and I was concerned why many architects disregard any kind of research in their decision making. And as a planner, I discovered that I don't really have to work with the architects, that actually people who do physical planning and planning set the guidelines and controls that tell the developers and the architects what they need to do. So I teach my students that basically you need to be able to look at a plan and evaluate it. You need to be able to ask the right questions and create the guidelines that structure things, and the architects have to follow it. So I'm not so worried about architects too much, and my talk today is going to be talking a bit about that. I'm interested in research that combines empirical research questions with issues of public policy. And my view of urban design is that it is in fact a public policy issue. By doing controls and regulations, we're making public policy decisions. So I'll be talking about oversized houses, affectionately called monster houses, tract mansions, mega houses, McManions. Starter castles, garage mahals, and I'll be discussing.
What's that last one?
Okay. I'll be going through three sets of studies. I'll be doing some descriptive studies of what's going on in the country in terms of these large houses. I'll be looking at the effects of two kinds of ordinances that are used to control them, and then I'll be discussing some hypothesis tests that we did to figure out what people ought to be controlling, what communities ought to be doing. And I wanted to... You may think this has nothing to do with the presentation, but I put this up here for an important reason. The reason this is up here is that it makes the argument that perception is more important than reality. Now, this actually happened to me. I'm a runner, and I was staying in a hotel a few weeks ago. I came back to the hotel after a morning run, and I stuck my hand into this jar of oranges to grab an orange. Now, the people at the desk looked shocked, and they basically said, "Stop! Those are not oranges." Now, I had one in my hand that felt like an orange, and had they not stopped me, I would have tried to peel the thing. But you could see it looks pretty much like an orange. So the perception defines my reality and defines my behavior. And so these perceptions, I believe, are very important. When I get around to the last set of studies, we'll be talking about perceptions related to McManions. I thought it was important to introduce this idea, though, for the rest of the talk. Why bother studying McManions? Where does it come from? My interest started a few years ago when I spoke to a real estate agent. I live in an inner ring suburb, which means that we're sort of landlocked. The council and mayor are interested in bringing in new development to help the tax base. I live in this inner ring suburb, and a real estate agent told me that she was befriending elderly residents. And I discovered the reason why she was befriending elderly residents is that when they died, she would get the first dibs on their house. She would buy the house. Our suburb has a deal where the fire department, when they're training the firefighters, will burn down a house for you. So she would buy the house, they'd burn it down, and she'd rebuild the McMansion. And when I first discovered this, I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting thing. Is it happening elsewhere? A few years later, an issue came up where my suburb has a historic designation for a district, meaning that many of the houses in it meet the standards for historic preservation. And some of them were being torn down and being replaced by not so good designs, and some were being replaced by pretty good designs. So there was a task force that was formed. I was on it, and they were trying to come up with legislation to deal with this problem. And so we started to look at, well, what's going on out there? How many of these things are there? It seems to be a big public policy issue in terms of making this decision in communities. Is there something that we can do in terms of research? We looked at the scholarly literature. There was very little done on it. Unless you think this is an American problem, this is a photograph of Orange County in China. This is actually echoing what we heard earlier, that when we started with house sizes of 800 square feet going up to 1,500 square feet, we found the same recent pattern where the house sizes are getting larger, the household sizes are continuing to get smaller, and the lot sizes are getting smaller. Now, this isn't all bad. A smaller lot size with a larger house on it means there's a little bit less infrastructure going into it. But this same pattern of larger and larger houses continues, and it raises some questions about what we want to do. So the number of homes that have more than 3,000 square feet have doubled. In historic area, the issue of the larger, there are two kinds of things we should consider. Plats of large houses, which is basically sprawl, and in urban areas like my inner ring suburb, putting in an infill house. They have different kinds of effects that might be positive and negative that we'll talk about. So the two kinds of things, we'll talk about infill houses and the greenfield plats. There was a lot of media coverage. I'm not going to go through it. When we first started to look around, we did discover that this is being covered in stories across the country for cities all around the place. So there seemed to be something going on. Again, through the media, we found that 40 communities had adopted policies, 30 were considering them. So again, we had some evidence that something was happening. We just didn't have an empirical base. And so we wanted to take a look at this. And so the first set of studies was a set of descriptive studies where we initially sampled the 50 largest cities in the country. We asked them about whether they had McMansions, whether they had regulations, what kind of regulations they had. And we asked them for other communities that had McMansions. And we used that to create a snowball sample of another 53 communities that we asked the same questions. And so this is the kinds of things we asked them. This shows you where the 50 largest cities were that we initially sampled. And this is just a quickie of the questions. So for the 50 largest cities, we find that many of them do have, in the greenfield plats, they do have these problems of McMansions. Many of them have several of them. And for the oversized infill, or tear-downs plus infill, which I'll be talking about more in the talk, same thing. Most communities said they have them. Most communities have more than 5. 20% or more, 29% reported more than 20. So from the evidence that we gathered, this seems to be a fairly big phenomenon that was happening in the US. These are the kinds of regulations they adopted. 53% adopted new regulations, or 47% adjusted the existing ones. And we find the same, I'm not going to go through the details, similar effects for the snowball sample, but higher rates, and that you'd expect because we're asking communities what's an area that has McMansion issues, and so they're identifying them. So we have some good evidence that this is, in fact, a national phenomena, similar patterns in terms of adopting new regulations. What kinds of regulations are they adopting? Height controls and design review. If you don't know what design review is, this community may have a set of standards for building. If a developer or a homeowner comes in, meets the standards, the staff member checks it off, and it goes forward. If they want to do something different, it may go before a design review commission or a design reviewer who looks at the design and talks to the person. They go back and forth, they negotiate until it gets accepted. The question is, if you're doing these kinds of controls, what do you control? A friend of mine who was head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority and did design review for them said that she had complete authority to do whatever she wanted. So if someone came in with a skyscraper that she didn't like, she could tell that person, I want you to do it in blue, and they had to do it in blue. Now, it would be nice if we knew if doing it in blue would actually improve the appearance of the skyline. And so in terms of McMansions, if a lot of these places are doing height controls, what's the appropriate height? If you're doing design review, what should you control? If you want to have a positive impact on the community, what do you need to control? And these are just some other controls that they did, much smaller numbers of them. I'll skip through this. We also looked at the places that that tended to have these oversized houses. For planners, if someone's hired as a planner in a community, they might want to know in advance that this is a community where this might happen so they can do something about it. So places with historic character or entering higher income suburbs. I'm going to change the one on the bottom here to edge nodes from edge cities. We heard discussion of boomburgs also, and then beach or resort communities. So the conclusions are fairly straightforward. There seem to be a lot of these communities out there, a lot of this stuff going on, and they are trying to control them. Interestingly, about half the communities aren't. They might be doing it for political reasons. When I was on the task force, there were people on the task force who incorrectly stated that the city had no right to regulate private property. And to that person, I wanted to say that I would like to put in a McDonald's in the house next to you and see whether you like that, whether you would approve that. Cities have absolute right to regulate private property, but certain people felt they couldn't. So for whatever, they might have felt it wasn't worth doing the regulations. We didn't find out why. So if a lot of cities are doing this, we want to learn a little bit more about it. Now on this task force that I was on, we were working through a mediated process. The historic preservation people wanted to stop people from tearing down houses and replacing them in the historic district. The property rights people said, you have no right to regulate this. The preservation folks said, we're neighbors, we could talk about it. There was a demolition moratorium ordinance on the boards that City Council was considering passing. And at that point, everyone said, let's get together, have a task force, and see if we could work up a consensus. And so we went through a number of meetings with a great mediator, and most people were actually in favor of doing a demolition moratorium. Stop the demolition in the historic district, with certain exceptions. If you have an economic reason or if your house is unlivable, there's certain standard legal reasons that you allow. Otherwise, most people were in favor of the moratorium. There were about, task force of about 23 people, about 5 or 7 were opposed to it for property rights reasons. A real estate agent in the meeting gets on his cell phone or his iPod and checks out what's going on in the country, discovers that a lot of communities in Massachusetts have this what's called a demolition delay ordinance. And that seemed like a reasonable thing. That ended up being the ordinance that we approved that went through the council. So the question that struck me was, okay, we just adopted a demolition delay ordinance. We know that a demolition moratorium stops them. You can't do, the burden of the proof is on the homeowner to come and make an argument why they deserve to take their house down. With a demolition delay ordinance, the deal is you get anywhere from 6 months to 24 months. You have to jump through some hoops, but after that, you can tear down your house. In our community, the hoops were, you had to meet with the neighbors and discuss it. You had to meet with a preservationist. You had to meet with the city planner. There were a few little, and then after 6 months, you could tear your house down if you wanted to. And the idea was that by meeting with a preservationist, you might learn about the value of your house and you might choose to not tear it down. By meeting with your neighbors, you might, if you did tear it down, you might learn something about what you rebuild there. So maybe you'd get something decent out of it. So to understand this, and I'm going to tell you this research didn't lead very far, we contacted 331 communities that we identified as having such ordinances. We got a huge response rate of 12.7%, which those of you who are psychologists would not be pleased with, as were we. We tried follow-up. It's just, we were asking planners and community people not just a yes or no question. We were asking them to go to the books and look at how many demolitions they had before the ordinance, how many they had afterwards. There were things they had to do research on, so it's understandable. And we asked for the average delay and what was the effect of it all. Most of these ordinances were, in fact, east of the Mississippi, a good deal in the Northeast, primarily because there were a lot of them in Massachusetts. The average delay was exactly what we adopted. Now, when we talked about the delay ordinance in my community, and the city attorney said, you better go with 6 months, because if we go longer than 6 months, the city's going to get sued, you're going to have legal expenses. And a number of us were saying, well, if someone's got has the money to tear down a $500,000 house, and then they're going to have to hire an architect to design a new house, it's going to take the architect 6 months to do the design. So a 6 month delay isn't going to stop anything. And I was pushing for Massachusetts, as I said, had some that were 12 months or 24 months. To get a consensus, we went with 6 months, and because the city attorney said that, we knew that the city council was going to listen to the city attorney. So 6 months. What was the effect before and after the ordinance? From the limited amount of data that we found, there was not an increase in demolitions after the ordinance. But it's sort of, we had such a small sample. it was hard to tell. What we did discover is that a lot more communities were starting to adopt these delay ordinances. So if anyone wants to give me a large grant to go person to person with these communities and study a larger sample, please come up afterwards. Anyhow, this is stuff this would be something that we need to do a better study of. But at least get some sense that maybe delay ordinances are working. What we're pushing for, and we've gotten some calls from communities that are considering this, and what we're pushing for is that if a community does do a delay ordinance, that they track what happened before and what happened afterwards. Basically, some form of evaluation. If a number of communities did this, we would then have the data, or someone would have the data, that you'd actually be able to access it and find out how effective this is. When we looked at these things, we started to think of a study that we had done in a town in Amarillo, Texas. Now these signs, I don't know if you can read that. Can you read the sign on top, people in the back? So there's an artist called Stanley Marsh who's responsible for the Cadillac Ranch in Texas, a bunch of Cadillacs planted like this. He set up a project where his shop would create a sign. They had poetry, they had insulting things, they had funny things, they had pictures, and they would bring it to your house. You would not necessarily know what the sign was, and they would install it in your front yard. And sometimes they would put 3 signs on a truck, and they would drive around the town. They'd come to your house, and they'd say, if you want one, we'll put it in concrete in your yard. So this one on the top says, if you took everybody who fell asleep in church and put them end to end in a line on the floor, they'd be much more comfortable. So some are funny, some are poetry, and so over a period of 5 years, it ended up that there were 5,000 of these signs in the front yards. And some people, they were planted in concrete. Some people, when they moved, they dug up the sign and they took them to California, wherever they went. Now, for a planner, the issue comes up, if you caught this phenomenon early, it's not that you want to prevent them from doing this, but you might want to have some regulations in place to make them less obtrusive. So when we interviewed the people who had the signs, they were perfectly thrilled with them. The neighbors, not so much. So there was so the issue with McMansions, I think, is similar. If you're a planner in a community where the first McMansion happens, you might want to catch it early and get in place regulations before you get 5,000 of them. And so we started to think about what kinds of things might you do in relation to this. The last set of studies have to do with the kinds of things you might control. And this comes from a planner, Kevin Lynch, one of the great leaders in planning in many fields, who talks about the shaping of places should be guided by a visual plan, a set of recommendations concerned with the visual form on the urban scale. We want to control what places look like. And this gets to the issue of, can we measure aesthetics? No, it's subjective, it varies from person to person. We can't measure that. Well, actually, the research in psychology suggests that we can. And it's no different from medical science to some extent. In medical science, we assume there are huge individual differences between people, and we're looking for commonalities. And so when you see these ads on TV for Cialis, and etc., you'll hear this long list of side effects. Those are the individual differences. They're looking for the commonalities. For urban design, we care less about how 1 or 2 people respond. We care about how a large number of people who pass by a place respond. In that case, we can measure the responses, the affective responses that people have to it. To give you an example, these 3 cars, if you look at each of those cars, I'm betting that each of you have guesses about who the likely owner is, who's likely to be driving the car on the top, what kind of person would be in the one in the middle, and my car on the bottom, you probably also have expectations. I don't have that car, but if you laughed at that, you're making a judgment that I probably don't have a Corvette. So there are, in fact, shared meanings about the environment. Some work that I've done, and I've also done with Ann Devlin here, looks at these different kind of house styles. And we found a cross between Columbus, Los Angeles, between Columbus, Ohio, and here, there are shared responses among people in terms of the meanings these houses convey. We also looked at a design of a art center in Columbus and found similarly when you ask people about their preferences for the design in relation to this model before it was built. It actually generalized very well to what the thing looked like on site. So to get to the studies, this struck me as a policy question that could tie to a theoretical issue. In psychology, there's a thing called the Weber-Fechner law. Are there psychologists in the audience? Students, how many people know that law? It basically says that the ratio of something is more important than the absolute size. So in economics, we'd say that you're not upset if your income is similar to your neighbor's income, whether it's a high income or a low income. You're upset about if your income is different from your neighbor's, it's lower than your neighbor's income. So the absolute value is less important than the ratio. And so we did a number of studies looking at infill housing in relation to absolute size versus the ratio of the size to its context, to get at that and to get at other issues like style. So this is showing you one of a bunch of simulations that we used. You can see the manipulation of style, and this is you're seeing one infill house in a context. This is the first of 6 studies that we did. Across the top, you're seeing, I think it's ratio. Across the bottom, across the side, you're seeing absolute size. In the middle, you're seeing different styles. With this study, we varied the distance that you're from the thing. Size, ratio, distance, and styles. We manipulated a bunch of variables to just get a sense of what was happening. And what we found was that the distance didn't matter that much. So that was an interesting thing which allowed us. The style did matter, and for subsequent studies, for subsequent studies, we were interested in looking at the ratio versus the absolute size. So we're going to control for style. We're going to look at things from a fixed distance and see what happens. We tended to do studies that looked at, in a lot of communities, when they do design review or design control, the words talk about compatibility, whatever that means. And so we wanted to measure compatibility, and we wanted to measure visual appeal. There's one thing presumably you're controlling compatibility to have some effect on visual appeal. So we wanted to see, does controlling compatibility have an effect on visual appeal? And does controlling style, absolute size, or size, whatever we tested, does it have an effect on visual appeal? So these are the kinds of measures we looked at. Getting to the second study, the first one sort of set up things. I'm not going to get into the details of all the statistics. I'm going to just touch base with what we found. So this one looked at ratio versus absolute size with style and distance control, and we just measured visual appeal. That's what you're trying to get to initially. And this is the stimuli, shown much smaller. These were shown to people in random orders. So you can see the ratio across the top up to, on the top right-hand side, it's saying that the ratio to that infill house is twice as big as what's around it. These absolute size and ratio variables are sort of, they fit one another in terms of what the numbers mean. So what happened? Oops. Well, basically, to our surprise, and of some interest, I guess, in terms of, there was basically very little effect from anything, which might be not a good thing, but it actually turned out to be an interesting finding. So it didn't matter, in terms of this research, if you put in a house next to the neighboring houses that was twice as big. This has some interesting implications for inner ring suburbs. If you want to attract income to your neighborhood, because you can't expand outward, but if you don't want to ruin the streets, this is saying, well, maybe you could accept an infill house that's twice as big as its neighboring houses. So you let someone expand their house on site, and it'll be suitable for the area. This has benefits in terms of sprawl, because if someone has an old little house, or not so little house in a neighborhood, if they could expand it and stay in that place, they don't have to move out to the exurbs to buy a bigger new house. So in a sense, if you come up with the right controls, people would prefer probably to stay in place than move. And if you can come up with the numbers that are appropriate, you may not have a negative effect on the neighborhood. So this led us to the Supersized study, where we went up to a ratio of 4 times larger. And we matched the absolute sizes. What we found in this study was the compatibility did correlate heavily with visual appeal. So controlling compatibility would have a positive effect on the way people would respond to it. You can see if you look at the graph, it's showing that the infill ratio is the thing that explained most of the variance. It had the biggest effect. And you can see that as the ratio gets larger, the perceived compatibility gets lower. So people, once you get over twice as big, it's not so good. And as you get larger, it gets worse. Explained a good deal of the variance. For visual appeal, you get the same kind of effect. So for communities, this is saying, well, if this holds, this is suggesting, well, you could let someone go in and tear down their house or remodel their house and double the size, and it won't have an effect. Now, interestingly, shortly after we did all this research, about 2.5 blocks from me, someone tore down a house and built a house that was twice as big as the neighboring houses. And being the empiricist that I am, and I live in a very friendly neighborhood, so I walk my dog and I see the neighbors, and I ask them, what do you think of the appearance of the house across the street from you? And every one of them said it's really nice. They did it. It was a nicely designed house, and it had no negative effect on the neighborhood. So within that, with this data sample of one of a real house put on the street, it seemed like doubling the size wasn't that bad a deal. Anyhow, we looked at width versus height. If you're going to control one thing or the other, there's a lot of evidence that people tend to notice the vertical dimension more than the horizontal dimension. So we thought height controls would be a better approach to do. And in fact, the research found that height ratios were much more important than width ratios. So if a community were to control one of those things, you'd be better off controlling height. And then we put a bunch of the stuff together. So we had earlier found that style compatibility was important. So now we wanted to see if we put style compatibility, ratio, and absolute size together into a study, could we get some sense of what's going on? Now we knew certain styles were perceived to be compatible with one another and some weren't. And so this I-beam style is one that's not compatible. And basically the results showed that style was the big thing. If you want to deal with compatibility and preference, you want to manipulate style. Next, you manipulate size. The combination of those two things could have a positive effect. So compatibility relates to liking. We supported the Weber-Fechner law. Absolute things are less important than ratio. For policy, with a bunch of caveats, you want to control style and size ratio relative to context. These are the caveats. We weren't looking at real world, even though we know that responses to photos generalize very well to responses to real places. We know that responses by one group of people, socio-demographic characteristics, age, gender, all sorts of things generalizes elsewhere. We still would want to know what happens in the real street. I would expect that in the real world you could actually go higher. When I look at the house that was built in my neighborhood, you saw the simulations that we had. It was a straight-on view of houses with no trees or vegetation. The one in my neighborhood had a large tree in front of it. It's got shrubs and things, so it's actually blocking the view of the house a little bit. So in the real world, I suspect you could go a little bit higher than twice. We didn't test long-term exposure. We don't know whether a person living across the street at this large house would eventually get more and more fed up with it, or they'd adapt to it. We don't know different street contexts, whether it be different in a historical district. And we don't know sort of real-world measures, what happens in terms of tax values, property values, crime, and that sort of thing. That said, we come up with tentative guidelines about trying to control style. If you're going to control infill ratios, up to twice as large is okay. Beyond that, you want to put in some control. This is a solution that is suitable to people who are concerned about property rights. You're saying you can go and expand your house up to a reasonable limit. And we believe that we need to do this sort of evaluation. As people do this in a community, we need to test and see what's happening.